let me deal with this point. What is it that we do about those things where we can respond? And I particularly want to single out issues where it is happening on account of righteousness. What do I mean by that? Well, just think of it like this. The Christian parent facing the conversion therapy laws that I talked about. Or the Christian foster parent facing the system. Or the Christian citizen facing the state when they're demanded to do something they don't want to do, like don't pray for that person. Well, you probably should pray for that person. Christian employee, facing HR when something goes wrong, when something's been said and there's been a complaint lodged. What about these situations? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that Jesus thought of this before you did. And he said something very interesting about it. In that opening monologue, I detected a little bit of depression, which is the point. But this is what Jesus said when he thought about this. He said, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In other words, he said there's a blessing here. Perk up. There's a blessing. I mean, do we believe that? And he goes on and doubles down. He says, "Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven." And I think it's very sad to see Christians living for this life. Christians living like this, like they've got blinkers on. And they're worried about all that's going on around them and the pressures of other people and the pressures of the institutions and all this kind of stuff. But the plumb line for your life, the basic guiding post for your life should be founded in the next life. And what you do daily should be defined by the next life. Jesus said, if you're making treasure on earth, and it's nice to make treasure on earth. It's fun. But here's the reality. It's all going to go. Moth will come in and eat it. Rust will get in and rust it, as he says. He says, thieves will break in and steal it. He says, the only lasting thing is the well done, good and faithful servant and what comes next. And we must never forget that. And people get overwhelmed in these moments and they forget where their anchor post is supposed to be. That is for context every day. Some people do turn to me at this point, because I've spoken on Matthew 5 before, and they say, Martin, but it's not persecution. Steady on, steady on. Persecution is the lions eating you and, lit up as torches in Nero's day. Fair enough. I'm not going to take that away from anyone who's been through that experience. But I want to make it very clear. Jesus defines his terms. He says, if they revile you, if they're angrily disgusted with you, if they insult you, if they speak all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Now, what does he mean by revile, angry, disgust? Well, how's this? Bigot? Hater? Homophobe? We know that's not true, don't we? It's just not true. In fact, it couldn't be possibly more wrong. And yet there you have it. That's the zeitgeist. That's the belief of our day. I think he is thinking about these things. I really do. Actually, it's getting harder and harder. I was actually following a live feed discussion thread during the Olympics because I was in Tasmania, biding my time to get over the Berlin Wall to come into WA. And I watched TV for the first time in at least 8 years. Can you believe that? And I turned on the Olympics, and I don't know if that's a badge of honor or if it's weird, actually. But I turned on the Olympics, and it was interesting. I was watching this live feed discussion thing of the Olympics, and you remember Nicola McDermott? Was that her name? The high jumper that got silver. And of course, she was obviously a Christian, and she was there with her journal with the cross. Honestly, the anti-Christian commentary just vomiting out of these people for minutes. They just couldn't let it go. And I thought, yeah, wow, okay. This is how so many people think about Christians. Well, Jesus said, well, take heart on this as well, because they persecuted the prophets who were before you. They had the same attitude. Here's an important thing. It's a feature, not a bug in the Christian life. It's really important to understand. When we do the download, we get a lot of young people come along, and one of the biggest pressing concerns for them, because they're just starting to realize they're not that popular in their beliefs, particularly at university and places like that. Fair enough, right? And the concern is, but how can everyone love me? How can I say it so that it doesn't land like a dead fish? How can I say it so that they all continue to be my friend? Oh, I'm sorry, it's a feature, not a bug. They're not all going to like you. Truth makes its own enemies. Jesus would never have said, for righteousness' sake, if this stuff didn't happen for righteousness' sake. Now, that doesn't mean be a jerk, of course. That's a whole other discussion. So don't. But my point is, you will never ultimately get there, because it is the fact, the truth, that makes the enemy so often. Now, I just want to be clear. Jesus saw this as situation normal. It comes out so clearly in all that he said, especially in John's Gospel. But he describes the Christian character in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, and his next statement is, "Blessed are the persecuted." He's thinking this is normal. There's two things he calls us to do. Two things. Number one, and these are what we can do. Number one, he says, be salt. Now, what does that mean? The thing about the salt is it's got to keep its taste. How does salt lose its taste? Salt loses its taste by reason of moisture compromising it. In other words, the environment it's sitting in gets into it. And so he's saying when you're feeling the pressure, the most important thing to do is do not compromise on the things that matter. And that begins with your Christian character. He says this very thing in Luke's Gospel in the midst of him saying, if your right hand offends, you cut it off. If your right eye offends, you pull it out. He's not really saying cut your hands off. What he is saying is get serious about sin in your life. Very serious. Get serious about holiness. Because you're living in a putrid world that seeks to corrupt you. And its standards are not God's standards, and they are not holy. And I think what we have to do as Christians, first and foremost, if we're to abide by this salt metaphor, and it comes before being light. It comes before the work of God going forward in the world so people glorify God, which is the next 2 points he makes. But first, he's talked about character in the Beatitudes, and now he says, don't compromise. And it starts in here. And this is why, if those of you who are watching the Perth live stream, this is why I touched on the subject of what we're putting into our brains and through our eyes. There's so many Christian people who are allowing things to happen on screens in their lounge rooms that they wouldn't allow to happen in their lounge rooms otherwise. And it's compromising them. And it's numbing you to sin and evil. And it's making you weak. And it's wrong, wrong, wrong. We have to start with making sure that we in our own hearts are not compromised. And that we are getting serious about sin in our lives. We must. Now, people say, oh, but, it's there for artistic value. And I say, well, that means you're being entertained by it. It's worse, not better. Okay? It starts there. And I make that point hard because I do believe that so much of what we want for the world starts with the people of God. And if we want the world to revive, if we want people to be changed in the world, we got to change. And we got to be the people God can use to make that change. And I tell you, light shines light. A dim light shines a dim light. A light that's gone out shines no light. Really, the nature of the thing itself is so often what creates its effect. And that is true with salt. No compromise. But of course, it doesn't just mean that. It means in actions publicly as well. For example, I think of that law, don't pray. Well, what's a person going to do if they get asked to pray about such a thing for such a person? The answer is you've got to pretend the law doesn't exist at that point. You've got to pray for them. Obey God, not men. There's not many laws in this country where that clash happens, but that is one of them where it's very, very clear. We've got to make sure we're not bending to these standards. We've got to, in fact, make sure that we are a Daniel. Daniel knew that he couldn't plan his life better than God could. He knew that he couldn't be pragmatic and practical and figure out how to generate the right outcomes. He knew when his day of testing came, when they said, compromise, whether it was his prayer, whether it was his eating of the king's food, all these things. What did he do? He said, no, I will do the right thing today. I won't compromise even in Babylon, and God will take care of tomorrow. And so he did. It's the story of Daniel's life. Didn't hurt him, did it? He served 5 kings. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but that's the reality. Salt, no compromise. Here's the second thing. The second thing we can do, the last thing we can do, be light. Be light. In other words, be visible, don't be under a basket. And this is a big challenge. The thing about being a Christian is you can hide. There's nothing really, hopefully you look like a relatively nice person. But the fact is you don't have to reveal who you are. That ship has sailed for me, let me tell you. But I didn't realize how I got away with it until I got the job with ACL because people will ask you early on in the conversation, what do? You've got to reveal, right? You've got to say. But see, that's a good thing. I have a friend, actually, and he said to me, he said, my pastor was saying a good thing the other day. He said, you should introduce yourself as a Christian. I'm not saying in a weird, awkward way, be like, hey, I'm Martin, I'm a Christian. But I do mean it should lead. It should lead in how you interact with the world. You shouldn't be in a workplace where they don't know. You shouldn't be in a university course where they don't know. People should know. Because visibility, now the problem is that if you're visible, you've got to live like it, right? That's the challenge. Because the point is, if you are visible and if you're salty, you've got to make a difference in people's lives. People will ask you, if you are different, they will ask you. And you will get opportunities. And if you think, well, I never get any opportunities, well, pray for some opportunities. And they will come, I can tell you from experience. Or create some. Maybe do say, I'm Martin and I'm a Christian. Not Martin, whatever your name is. And see what happens. They might not pick it up, they might drop it. But visibility is so crucial because if you are visible, then people know what makes you tick. They know why you are the way you are. And you can don't get too keen about what you can accomplish. Sometimes you just accomplish something with someone. You're not going to change everyone's worldview in a single conversation. That's a big mistake we make, right? We think we'll have a conversation with someone and they'll just say, wow, you're right, blow me down. It doesn't usually happen that way. You might get to loosen one of the bolts, right? Good, the light's got to be on to loosen one of the bolts. Or you might be given an opportunity to put a rock in their shoe, as a friend of mine used to say. That's something that makes them think, You just never know. And I will say, I don't want to... I'm always mindful talking about these things. It's not us versus LGBT. But I do want to say this about the LGBT community, is they've done this brilliantly. Visibility. Brilliant, right? Cracking strategy. And everybody knows someone from the LGBT community. I'm sure most of us here do. But the thing is, when you do the surveys and you say to people, do you know a serious Christian? The numbers don't stack up. People say no when they surely do, because there's so many of them. A huge number of people, but the light's got to be on. And if we do all of that, the work of God will advance. Do you notice we started this section about persecution, where you're on the back foot? All of a sudden we're walking the other way. Jesus says they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So he closes out. Now he doesn't say they might, or he doesn't say make it so. He says they will. If you're salt and light, they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Sometimes the noise and the negativity is very loud. I've certainly found that. And we can think that that's all there is. But let me tell you, if you're salt and light, the good stuff is happening. But it usually happens very quietly. I've been so blessed, particularly through this tour, to meet people who come up to you and say, this is how I've been impacted. And you go, oh, good stuff is happening in the world, and you get this quiet stories whispered in your ear. It is happening. Jesus said that it would happen. And I want to finish with this. Note what is the ultimate goal. We can't lose this even in the political sphere. The ultimate goal is that people would glorify God. The ultimate goal is the changing of hearts, the restoration of souls, God's glory. We're not here just to do good things for the sake of doing good things. Well done, good and faithful servant, for pretending, deliberately not mentioning Jesus or the Bible every time you spoke, and just doing good things for the sake of it and letting people win the whole world and lose their soul. I don't think that's how it's going to go. The reality is that ultimately we must never forget that the final destination that God desires for every single person is that they would know Christ. And we need to be salt and light to that end. To that end. And so we must never hide the true reality of that in our lives so that it may transform other lives on the same basis. There's all kinds of ways in which people are drawn into that. And that's why we do so many things in so many public places. But what's the ultimate goal that we've always got in the back of our head? It is Christ, and it is that people would come to know him. I'm Mark Niles, and that was the truth of it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.